All right. Good morning, everyone. Dr. Sinner, feel free to jump in if you want to add anything. So we are going to talk about systematic reviews today. Why do we call systematic reviews systematic reviews? Why are they called systematic reviews?
Systematic methodology of how to review.
Exactly, because you have a specific research question and you have a systematic approach to answer the question, and it is not, it's everything is step by step, everything is defined, everything is pre-designed, and you have to follow that that specific protocol to arrive at an answer for the research question. It is called a systematic review. What's a meta-analysis? The meta-analysis is when you pool the data from several studies. At the end of a systematic review, you pool the data from different studies and create one pool of data, and then you present the results of pooled data, right? Can a systematic review, or let me put this way, does a systematic review have to have a meta-analysis? Can you have a systematic review without meta-analysis? Yes, it's the systematic review that matters, not the meta-analysis. And we will talk why some systematic reviews do not have meta-analysis. It's a systematic review that we care about, not necessarily the meta-analysis. We'll talk about that. So the systematic approach for systematic reviews starts with a specific, predefined, focused research question. The research question has to be very focused. It cannot be broad. They usually you don't see a systematic review that says, treatments for headache. It has to be specific, Reglan for headache or Reglan for migraine, right? So usually the focus of systematic review is very narrow, and you define the systematic, the elements of PICO. You have a specific population, you have a specific intervention, you have a specific comparison and a specific outcome. And the beginning of the systematic review, these populations and interventions are defined exactly what kind of intervention we are talking about, what kind of outcomes we are looking at, and what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So the systematic review at the beginning says, we are going to enroll studies, because in systematic reviews, you enroll studies, you include studies. So we are going to enroll studies that looked at this specific population. They had this specific outcomes. They excluded patients with this specifications. And so the inclusion and exclusion criteria for enrolling the studies in the systematic review is pretty clear at the beginning. And then the study designs that you're looking for. So if the systematic review looking at a therapy question, they usually say that we only looked at randomized controlled trials, right? If it's a diagnostic trial, they will say we only looked at blanking out. The studies of diagnostic trials. And so this is the most important element of systematic review, that you start with clearly defining your research question, specifically clarifying your PICO and the study design that you're enrolling. And then you move on to the next stage. Now, another reason why a systematic review is called systematic review is because you have a systematic approach to make sure that you find every possible article or study that meets your criteria, right? So how do you start the search? First, you look at PubMed, right? And PubMed, you have to have a specific search strategy. Usually, an experienced librarian designs the search strategy. This is not where you just go type TPA and stroke to look for articles. This has to be a pre-defined, pretty detailed search strategy, usually designed by a librarian. or an experienced person. And then you use that to look at PubMed. What other databases do you search? What other databases have you heard of? Medline, PubMed, same thing, yeah, same different platform, correct. What other databases? Cochrane, correct. So Cochrane is another database. Cochrane, you can look for studies that were done, but also Cochrane has a registry for clinical trials. So you can see if a study is ongoing, and if the study is of interest to you, you can communicate with the authors and say, hey, when are you publishing your results? Some people even are willing to, it's better not to include unpublished results, but they can give you a heads up. Like I had communication with an author, and he said, I have submitted my paper to British Medical Journal. As soon as they accept it, I'll send you a copy of the. Another place to look for another databases. EMBASE. Have you heard of EMBASE? So EMBASE is usually European or for non-English papers. There are a lot of papers on EMBASE that are not part of PubMed. There's a big overlap, but a lot of non-English, non-American papers are listed in EMBASE. And EMBASE there are a lot of similarities with PubMed, but you have to have a different search strategy to look for EMBASE to make sure that if the journal that the paper is published in is not listed in PubMed, you still have to be able to find it using different databases. And there are other databases like Web of Science. People also do Google Scholar and other places, but the two main databases are PubMed and EMBASE that you definitely have to search. And then you also have to make sure that there are no, as I said, no ongoing studies in progress that you want to know about. Where do we register clinical trials? clinicaltrials.gov, right? So you go to clinicaltrials.gov to see if there are if the studies are going on and that you want to include, and you might want to wait for them to get published so you can communicate with the authors and get update on where they are in terms of recruitment. So we did our database searches. We searched the trial registration sites like Cochrane and clinicaltrial.gov. What other things do we have to know, do we have to do to make sure we are not missing any of their studies? This is the part that's called gray literature, meaning that it's not major databases, but it's the papers could be hidden somewhere. So one of the things that you can do is you pull the articles that you have found or relevant articles, and you look at the references of those papers, because sometimes you can find some studies that are useful to your systematic review in the references of those relevant articles. This is called gray literature search, right? So example that I always give is one of the best papers written on clinical decision rules. The title of the paper is Shooting an Elephant, because they used an analogy in that paper. So if you do clinical decision rules and design whatever you want, you're not going to find these articles. But if you look at the references, this is a paper that has been referenced on every paper that discusses clinical decision. So that's one way of gray literature. Another thing you have to do is you look at the abstracts presented in relevant specialties in the, let's say in the past 5 years. Because if you look for abstracts, somebody presented this abstract 2 years ago in, let's say, Society for Academic Emergency Medicine on this topic, you can follow with the author or look for that paper to see if it's published or not. And that way you make sure that you're not missing any paper. So this is called, again, gray literature search. And the last element of gray literature search is contacting the experts. So you contact the people that are expert in the field and you say, are you aware of any studies that is published or being published on this topic? And they will give you, you know, if they know, they will let you know. I was writing a systematic review on tranexamic acid, and I contacted Ian Roberts, who did the Crash 2, Crash 3 papers. And he said, oh yeah, there's a guy in Thailand who's doing something on tranexamic acid for traumatic brain injury, and he's almost done. And I contacted him, and he was the one who said, yes, I have submitted my paper to British Medical Journal. As soon as they accept it, I'll send it to you. There was no other way for me to find out that paper. And I got finally the results and included in the systematic review. So remember, gray literature search is an important element of literature search in systematic reviews. Any questions so far? All right. So when you do a search, you usually come up with, let's say, thousands of citations, thousands of hits, and then two authors usually separately go through this, use an inclusion-exclusion criteria, go through the list of the citations and decide, you know, based on the title, based on the abstract, or based on reading the whole thing, decide that, you know, these papers are relevant, these papers are not relevant. You never see a systematic review published by one person, right? Because it's an integral part of systematic review. There are several steps that need to be done by two separate people, and then there is a third author that you know, helps when there is a discrepancy, or the two authors resolve their discrepancy by consensus. Okay, so then you go through the list and you say 30 papers were relevant. We read all of them. We applied inclusion-exclusion criteria, and we arrived at 5 trials, right? And then that 5 trials, now we start on working on the systematic review, analyzing these trials. Let me just go back a little bit. Systematic reviews are the highest level of evidence, correct? However, just because something is called a systematic review doesn't mean it's a good evidence. I don't want to be racist, or it has nothing to do with Corona, but these days, more systematic reviews come out of China than plastic toys. Anything you search, there are like tons of systematic reviews by Chinese authors, and a lot of them, unfortunately, are really not good qualities. Because of my job at the NNT.com, I read a lot of systematic reviews because we read our NNT reviews based on high quality systematic reviews. So I have to read a lot of systematic reviews to filter out what's good and what's not. And unfortunately, there are a lot of poor systematic reviews with poor methodology out there. So you cannot take it for granted. Just you have to critically appraise the systematic review, look at the methodology before you rely on the results. And one of the elements, one of the criteria that I always use to decide whether I'm reading the rest of systematic review or not is the type of studies that they included. So if it's a therapy article, and you see that in the first section of the results section, they say we included, you know, 7 trials, 3 systematic reviews, 2 retrospective studies, and 3 observational studies. This is where you put the brake on. You can throw this out. You're not supposed to include case series or retrospective studies or registry trials in a systematic review because of the high risk of bias.
Why not?
Right. So look at this. Look at the systematic reviews. Look at the section that says how many trials they are including, and look at the design. You cannot use retrospective studies, case series, observational studies in therapy questions. And for every, in general, retrospective studies and observational studies, the results cannot be pooled. They should not be part of systematic reviews. You can mention them, but you're not supposed to use them. So this is a section that I usually, people send me systematic reviews. They say, I want to write an NNT on this, and I look and I see they included retrospective studies, and that's a 2-second decision, no, you cannot use this, right? So if it's a therapy question, it has to be RCTs. If it's a diagnostic study, it has to be properly done diagnostic trials. Generally, retrospective studies, observational studies, case series, no. So then moving on, an important element of systematic reviews is quality assessment. So you have to assess the quality of the trials that you have, because that will determine the level of the quality of evidence, right? So for RCTs, we have a specific quality assessment tools. For diagnostic studies, we have a specific quality assessment tool. The best one that everyone is encouraged to use are grade criteria. These are the same people that wrote the JAMA Guide to the Literature in the 90s. Now they have published a series of quality assessment tools in Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. It's called GRADE, G-R-A-D-E. Stands for grading, review, something, but it's grade criteria. And what's interesting about grade criteria is it assesses the quality of outcomes based rather than specific studies. So it will tell you that, for example, in this article, when you're looking at outcome of mortality, the quality of the evidence for outcome of mortality is low, very low, or moderate or high. The quality of the studies for outcome of, PE recurrence is this or that. So at the end of the systematic review, you can say, for mortality, the quality of evidence is good, but for everything else, the quality is not good. You can toss it. So grade criteria is are probably the best we have, but there are also other validated way of assessing the quality of systematic of trials, and just doing the quality assessment and referring and doing a table is not enough. And that's one of the other limitation of a lot of systematic reviews, that they look at do the quality assessment and they say, but the quality assessment is results are in table 2, and then moving on. You have to do something about the studies that are rated low quality, right? You cannot just include them in the analysis and refer to a table that this quality was poor. What do you do to address this issue? So let's say you have 5 trials, and out of your 5 trials, 4 of them have acceptable quality and 1, the quality is low. How do we address this? And this paper is actually a very good example of this. Something is called sensitivity analysis. And sensitivity analysis means that it's like you stress test your results to see how robust your findings are by tweaking the analysis. So in this case, let's say you have 5 trials and 4 of them are good quality, 1 is not good quality. You do your analysis on 5 trials and you have 1 result. Then you do a sensitivity analysis by removing that study that doesn't have a good quality and redo your analysis with the 4 that have high quality. And then you check to see if the results stay the same. If the results completely changes, then you have a problem, right? And you can do this with the studies. A lot of systematic reviews, you have 1 study that has a very large sample size and completely skews the results to one way or another. And in this case, you do the analysis for all the trials together, and then you remove that study with the largest sample size, redo your analysis. This is called sensitivity analysis, to see if the results stand, right? And they did this in the paper several times for several reasons, and they tested the robustness of the results. We'll check, you have to check for publication bias. I won't go through the details of how to check for publication bias, but just a quick note. Studies that have a large sample size get published whether their results are positive or negative, right? They generally get published even if they have negative results. Studies with low sample sizes, if they're negative, it's really, really difficult for them to get published. Either the journals keep rejecting them and the authors can't publish them, or the authors decide not to send them somewhere. But negative results are, or negative trials are as important as positive trials, right? And you know, if you look at the TPA studies, there are so many negative trials that never got published, or they stopped halfway because of futility. And the systematic reviews, they're not included in the systematic reviews. And that's why you get all these glorious results about TPA. But there's a significant publication bias, because the studies that the neurologists did the study and they didn't like the results because they were negative, they tossed it. They either didn't publish it or they stopped halfway. Yes?
Are you saying that the negative studies have a small sample size because they didn't like the results in the top, or they just happen to have a small sample size in the hospital or whatever?
Mostly because it was the way it was designed, a small sample, the sample size was small, or because both. So, you know, they did a small study on 100 patients and this results was negative. Most journals don't publish something with 100 patients, especially on an important topic. Or they plan to enroll 1,000 patients. When they got to 100, they noticed that the results are not going to be what they expected and they killed the study, right? But when you don't have those negative results, your findings are going to be skewed towards positive results, right? So that's why it is important to look for publication bias, and it's done by funnel plot. And there's a statistical test, but also there's a visual way of looking at it, which we won't go through the details. So it is important to make sure in systematic reviews you have all the negative results, positive results, small sample sizes, big sample sizes, everything included. And then the last element of systematic reviews is, before you go into results, it's heterogeneity. Heterogeneity comes from differences in patient population, differences in inclusion-exclusion criteria, differences in outcomes. For example, if some studies enrolled patients in emergency departments, some studies enrolled in outpatient clinics, some studies enrolled inpatients, somebody looked at 1 week mortality, somebody looked at 30-day mortality. This results in heterogeneity. And one way of, there are statistical tests for heterogeneity, but you can also look at the forest plot. So this is a forest plot. This is, let's say, odds ratio or relative risk of 1. This is a no benefit. Anything on this side favors placebo. Everything on this side favors treatment. And then you have the study A, B, C, D. So this is in forest plot, you actually visually can look at the results. So this one, A, this is the favors control, and this is this confidence interval for it. B, the results are here. This is a confidence interval for it. C comes here, and D, let's say, comes. I'm going to put this one here. Right? So when you look at this forest plot, you see some of them are non-significant, close to 1. Some are significant, completely on this way. This is heterogeneity, because you can see that the results of the studies are all over the place. When the heterogeneity is low, you'll see one here, then this one, and then maybe this one. So the studies are usually, most of the studies are on one side, they're close to each other. That's usually visually, you can say the heterogeneity is low. There's a test, there are several tests to do to test heterogeneity. One of them is the one that they use, the I2, and you get a number from 0 to 100. Usually 0% is no heterogeneity, up to 0.7, 0.75 is moderate heterogeneity, and anything more than 0.75 or 75% is significant heterogeneity. Why this is important? Because if you have significant heterogeneity in your study, in your systematic review, you're not supposed to pool the data. So this is when you see a systematic review with no meta-analysis, because you are, this heterogeneity tells you that you have, your data is all over the place, your studies are all over the place, and you don't want to combine the heterogeneous data into a meta-analysis, because the result is going to be something garbage. And then the last part is, you know, if the heterogeneity is acceptable, you can pool the data. There are two types of pooling. You can do patient level data or trial level data that we don't go through the details. They pool the data and they give you one final results about the outcome. And if they don't pool the data, they just give you the raw data, the raw results of each trial. And they say, you know, trial A showed this, trial B showed this, trial C showed this, and they don't pool the data together. Pooling is an important part. You have to make sure all the requirements are there before you pull the data. And again, you're not supposed to include retrospective studies, observational studies, case series into the pooling, because that's where the term garbage in, garbage out comes through. You put some garbage in the meta-analysis and you get some results that are true garbage. Okay. Anything else I think interesting? Okay.
You want to do the breakout group? We have both of you here instead of virtually. Do you want to do everybody? Just a room.
Can we pull up the Prisma checklist? We got it. Sure that the desktop is still sharing. Good. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, so first one, title, identify the report as a systematic review. Check. Structured summary, describe as applicable, background, objective, data source, everything. Study eligibility criteria. What were the study eligibility criteria in this case? Just quickly.
In the body of the paper, but not in the summary.
Okay.
Like not in the abstract.
In the abstract, got it. But they still have to briefly mention what they included in the abstract. So introduction, they have to explain the rationale for the study, you know, what has been done in the past, what the systematic review is trying to answer. And then at the end of the introduction, the objectives of the systematic review has to be clearly explained. One thing I forgot to mention was that's just like clinical trials, now you have to register systematic review. So before you do a systematic review, you have to register your systematic review, because just like clinical trials, they don't want you to start your systematic review and then adjust your inclusion exclusion criteria or objective or your methodology based on what you find. It has to be done beforehand. So Prosperous is one, but there are other registries for systematic reviews that you register systematic reviews, you provide the details of your systematic review in there. So everyone knows what you had planned in advance, and you stick to those plans, and you don't change it as you go. By the way, one of the interesting findings on one of these papers that got published on COVID about hydroxychloroquine from China. They had, if you go back to clinicaltrial.gov, or I forgot where they registered it, what they registered and what they reported was completely different. They were supposed to have 3 groups. They had to have different comparisons, different analysis, and what was published in New England Journal of Medicine was completely different from what they had planned initially. And this was New England Journal of Medicine. Unfortunately, I think in the COVID thing, the journals completely dropped the ball because they didn't want to be left behind. They wanted to be the first that they published. So a lot of garbage got published in New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Lancet, because they basically took everything. And this paper was a good example of why we need the clinical trial registry, because they changed it based on the result of what they found. They completely changed the reporting, even though they had planned something completely different. Off the topic. All right, let's get to the topic. Was this systematic review registered? Do they mention that they registered it?
No.
No, it was not registered. Not good. Eligibility criteria, they have details of their part codes, the length of follow-up. I thought the eligibility criteria was very detailed and very clear.
The other thing is that they don't register it. So anyone who really does systematic reviews and knows about systematic reviews knows that you should register it.
Right.
So if they don't register it, then you have to question their knowledge of systematic reviews.
That's true. Yeah, if you're not an expert on systematic review, you shouldn't be writing systematic reviews. And if you're an expert, you know that you have to be registering it. Correct. So what databases did they search? I'm at number 8. Sorry, 7 and 8. They did the minimum. They looked at Cochrane. They looked at EMBASE. They looked at Medline. What gray literature search did they do?
They wrote some letters to a couple of the authors.
So they contacted the experts. That's one. They looked at references of relevant articles, right? Did they look at the proceedings of conferences? They didn't. It's a big part of gray literature search, that you have to look at least 3 to 5 years of published abstracts of the conferences to make sure you're not missing anything. The study selection, it looks like it looked to me that they described the way they screened. They checked the eligibility, and every systematic review has to have this flow chart, right? That says we found this number of patients from different sources. We excluded this number of studies based on just the title, this number based on abstract, and they reviewed how many paper they read in entirety, and then how many they arrived at the end. This flow chart is an important part of systematic review.
They work with the librarian.
They said they have the list of the details of the search strategy published in the appendix, but they didn't mention anything about the library. Some research question of this significance has to involve a librarian for the search, definitely. Data collection process. So usually the systematic reviews develop a protocol. They develop forms that each author separately goes through and checks the inclusion exclusion criteria, and then the 2 authors sit together and go through the discrepancies. It seems like they explain that and they follow the specific process. Although I don't remember they mentioned the protocol that they developed beforehand.
Were they blinded? I didn't see
Don't remember.
Why don't see.
Number 10, describe method of data extraction. It's detailed in the paper. Number 11, list and define all variables of which data were sought, PICO, funding sources, and other assumptions. I thought that was appropriate. Risk of bias in individual studies. What did they do to assess the quality of the trials? JDAT, which is an older one. It's an old thing, but still is a decent. When was this paper published? 2014, maybe. So they did assess the quality of the trials. And what kind of study designs did they pick? RCTs only, right? They didn't include any observational studies. They clearly said that they were only going to look for RCTs, which is appropriate. Risk of bias in individual studies are described. Summary measures. What do they report as summary measures? Are they odds ratios? So usually you do either odds ratios or relative risk. They report as odds ratios. 21, present results of each meta-analysis done. So was meta-analysis appropriate here or not? They did a statistical method to measure heterogeneity, and the I2 was 0. Remember I said between 0 to 100. So it is really hard to believe that there was 0% heterogeneity.
It never happens.
It's never happened.
Never done a systematic review.
And especially for TPA with all different types of presentations and clinical setting. But you know, they say it was 0%. But when you look at when you look at the forest plot, the heterogeneity is there, but even if it's there, it's not significant because you don't see the results spread all over the forest plot. They're usually on either side of the line, the midline, but not too far apart. So if the heterogeneity is there, but it's not significant. You also have to use your own judgment to see if there's clinical heterogeneity. Sometimes the statistical heterogeneity says there's no heterogeneity, but clinically, you know that their heterogeneity is there because they, you know, as I said, my example, patients were enrolled from inpatients and outpatients. Some studies were done in, you know, third world countries. Some were done in tertiary care centers in the US. You know that there is clinical heterogeneity is there, and that should also be included in you judging the results. Additional analysis. So this paper is a perfect example of sensitivity analysis. They realized that one of the study, they did the analysis on all the studies, and they decided to do analysis by taking studies out one at a time. And this is perfect because it shows if one study contributes significantly to the results, if you take that study and the results changes, then you have a problem. And they did that, and they identified one paper that when they took it out, it significantly affected the results. And they also did a bunch of other sensitivity analysis, and they tested the robustness of their results. Like when they bunched all the TPA studies together, there was a mortality benefit. When they looked at them separately based on the risk, there was no mortality benefit, right? So this is a good, honest way of showing your results. Summary of the evidence. I thought that was acceptable. Limitations, conclusion, we'll skip those. So overall, are you happy with the methodology of the systematic review? Yeah, I mean, there are limitations. but nothing major, nothing big. The quality assessment was done properly. The sensitivity analysis was done properly. Especially the sensitivity analysis was honestly done, and they looked at all possibilities, and basically they arrived at the conclusion that the results cannot be trusted, right? This is what they say, for the most part, that this is, basically unanswered questions.
Not the most systematic.
Correct. You got to be lucky to get a really good definitive yes or no. That's why we have a lot of yellow color recommendation on NNT.com, right? Very few gets green or red. Any questions about systematic reviews, meta-analysis? Sorry, this was a little bit long details, but I feel like this is an important thing that you need to know, because just because, as I said, something says it's a systematic review meta-analysis doesn't mean that the evidence is reliable. You still have to do use diligence. You still have to critically appraise the systematic review, and the things to pay attention to. The type of the studies, the study designs that they included. You can easily eliminate a lot of systematic reviews by that. Look at the heterogeneity. If the heterogeneity is significant, either by looking at the forest plot or look at the statistical method. If the heterogeneity is significant and they report pooled results, no good, throw it out. If they do quality assessment and most of the studies that they assessed have low to very low quality evidence, you don't have to read the systematic review. So there are major checklists that you can check and say this is garbage. And unfortunately, there are lots and lots and lots of systematic reviews that are garbage out there. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.